Saudi Cup, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. Today's video, we're going to follow on from our safer use enhancement framework for women discussion we had yesterday. So today I want to introduce the concept of, so where do androgens, where does testosterone at superphysiological range or one of the testosterone derivatives fit into our safer use framework? It's very important that people try to listen very carefully to what I'm saying when I present this material, because I completely understand if people are not actually taking the time to listen and consider what is being said. It's very, very easy to misunderstand or misinterpret or feel like I'm unnecessarily vilifying the use of androgens with women. Not at all. I am suggesting that we need to, because of the unique situation with the elevation of androgen levels in women and the consequential effects of that behavior, we need to be very cautious and very strategic. Strategic here is the key word, with when we apply androgens over the lifetime of a female athlete. So let's crack on with the video. This video is brought to you by enhancedwomen.com. This is, as I understand it, the only website in the world of its kind that is dedicated and will be developed specifically with the needs of enhanced women in mind. So let me just have a quick refresher of the conversation that we had yesterday. Again, if you have not seen the previous video that talks about the safer use framework for women, please stop this video. Go and watch that first, because you need to watch that video before you're even going to understand, where we're picking up here. Let me just cover a little ground that we covered yesterday. So understanding that the challenges for women with the enhancement community are massively, just vastly different to the challenges of men. Men have a great many health concerns, from cardiac to kidney to brain function. Yes, agreed, vascular issues. And the list is quite extensive. I'm not suggesting that we cannot, with careful compounded dosage selection and behaviors and ancillaries, mitigate those risks, but the risks are different for women. And anyone that watched the video yesterday hopefully can understand where I'm going with this framework and saying, look, the items in the green square here, so all of the compounds, all the behaviors in the green square, if they are executed as described, represent zero virilization, masculinization risk to women. And therefore, it makes logical and rational sense with a cohort that are extremely sensitive to that issue, that they try to spend most of their career operating within that green square. Now, obviously, on occasion, for strategic purposes, we are going to want to basically raise our risk profile. And when we do that, the behavior that we execute to do that is by adding something in from the red square. It's really as simple as that conversation. If you are within physiological range of androgens, and the big misnomer here is, well, just exactly how much testosterone does it take for women to bounce against the natural limits? It's on average about 3 milligrams a week of a drug like testosterone enanthate. This study is basically from 2014. We can consider this study to be akin to the studies that were done on graded doses of testosterone in men, where they administered 50, 125, 300, 600 milligrams of testosterone to men, and they basically looked at consequence of effect. It's a very similar study done in women, basically where they administered graded doses of testosterone, 3, 6.25, 12.5, and 25 milligrams a week, and looked at the consequence effect. There's very good information in the study. We will be digging into that information in future material. For the purposes of this video, it's important to understand that women that are exposed to superphysiological levels of testosterone or testosterone derivatives, anabolic and androgenic steroids, right? When you cross the superphysiological range for androgens, it is just an expectation that eventually it is inevitable that you will start to see signs of masculinization or virilization. in this particular study, in this particular cohort, at 3 milligrams a week of testosterone, bouncing against the limits of natural range, there were no reported consequences of virilization. So I think it's fair to say that that's a reasonable place for us to operate with minimal risk threshold. Okay. Now, as they raised the dose, eventually they started to see consequence here. Okay. So that should not be any surprise to anyone on any level. Now, the challenge here, as I said, is understanding that if you want to minimize your risk of virilization, masculization, the number one issue that women should be concerned about, as I mentioned in the previous video, I am not for one moment saying we shouldn't be getting pathology work, we shouldn't be getting imaging scans. I'm saying to you that if you look at the information we have on the transgender community, doctors, medical professionals are more than happy to administer androgens at what can only be described as virilizing and masculinizing intent. Okay, you are deliberately and intentionally taking a human being that was born identifying oneself as a female and introducing enough androgens to create cosmetic appearance differences, in the intent of basically gender transition with no health concerns. They're not worried about their kidneys. They're not worried about their liver. They're not worried about the cardiovascular system. Why? Because they actually have some evidence to support the fact that doses of androgens at those levels to elicit those outcomes are well tolerated, right? So it's not a logical, rational thing to be going, look, the blood work is going to tell me the story here. Why? Because we have, very good evidence that shows that women can tolerate the amount of androgens that it takes to basically become, what identified as transgender without health issues. Right? So this idea that blood work will, lead the way, this is just not true for women. Should you do blood work? By all means. But there is a separate issue here, virilization, masculinization. So if we operate within the bounds of that framework, if we learn to understand drugs like testosterone, potentially some of the SARMs, drugs like clenbuterol and beta-2 androgenic agonist, recombinant human growth hormone, and obviously various insulin analogs and a range of different products. This is the 5 that I would lead with, and then understand that on occasion, we are going to dip into the anabolic steroids basket and bring it into our behaviors because there are outcomes in terms of protein accretion increases that behavior brings to the table. It brings the risk with it as well. So in other words, we need to bring the red square in a strategic and systematic way, not just randomly start taking androgens at physiological levels. That's just going to end badly after many years of exposure. Okay. So the first thing I want to get into here is understanding the various testosterone derivatives. Very often, if you speak to individuals, you'll hear them say things like, they favor one anabolic steroid over another in women, and I'm empathetic to that, but very often the underlying justification for that study just makes no sense whatsoever. I just want to explain a little bit about the myotrophic androgenic ratio of various anabolic steroids, testosterone derivatives, because this is very, very poorly understood in our community. Firstly, you must understand that most anabolic and androgenic steroids have undergone what they were referred to as Hirschberger assays. Okay, most anabolic steroids have actually undergone more than one variation of the Hirschberger assay. They actually have a number of variants, and each methodology of testing typically produces different outcomes. An example, when we look at the drug primobolan, it's widely reported in information that basically primobolan has a fairly modest androgenic to anabolic impact. In other words, it's not particularly a highly anabolic drug, but you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side that there's a range of results range from basically 2-to-1 to 30-to-1. So in other words, primobolan is either probably the shittiest basically anabolic that we have in terms of myotrophic to androgenic ratio, or the best one. And that's going to depend on, so which assay are we considering here? And very often, far too often in this tribe, what happens is individuals grasp onto a single study. They obsess about a study and they use it as a proof point to prove their points. The only way you can rationally and logically make decisions about drugs is to look at the totality of information that we have on the subject. And when you do that, what you'll realize is the first misunderstanding about these compounds is that very few of these compounds have Hirschberger assays which repeat themselves over and over again, showing the same myotropic to androgenic ratio. They vary. And very often, as I said, you will find reference material that grab onto one of those assays and print it as fact. Prima Bolin has said, great example here. I believe, if I'm correct, that this information is from Bill Llewellyn's handbook, where he's saying, this is the androgenic and anabolic ratio. We all know that that book has got a lot of mistakes in it, a lot of mistakes, including suggesting that the androgenic anabolic ratio of trenbolone is 500 to 500. What a load of rubbish. Trenbolone is a steroidal SARMs. So in this situation, Bill has basically said, okay, so this is the anabolic to androgenic ratio. The impact of that book in our community has been profound. People take it as fact when they shouldn't. In reality, as you can see on the right-hand side, this drug has basically been through a number of Hirschberger assays that range from, that's not very good, to, wow, that's probably the best drug that we have. The takeaway is this: when you make decisions, you must consider all of the available data that we have on a subject, not a study. Don't gravitate, don't grab onto, don't bias yourself, don't cherry pick studies, guys. Okay, let me just basically explain for people that don't understand the premise here. There are a number of drugs that have been developed over the years with the intent of realizing or maintaining the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, but removing or biasing the anabolic androgenic ratio so that they can be deployed in females and the androgen sensitive. And you can see the graphic on the left-hand side is showing the relative efficacy of the SARMs LGD 4033, Ostarine, and on the right-hand side, we can look at the similar impact of the testosterone propionate, which is the dark black line, and of course, trenbolone, which is the dotted line. Now, you can see in the example of testosterone, the anabolic to androgenic ratio is considered to be 1-to-1, but they approximate each other. In the steroidal SARMs, basically trenbolone, you can see on the image on the right-hand side, this drug is far, far less androgenic than it is anabolic. Okay? It is a steroidal SARMs. And you can see with the non-steroidal SARMs, we are chasing the same effect, where we are biasing towards anabolic return at minimal impact in terms of androgenicity. But this is the but, guys. What a lot of people don't understand is, so how did we arrive at those numbers? Quite simply, we basically take rats and we administer these compounds to rats for a fixed number of days. Typically, they are male rats that are initially castrate. And then basically we administer these drugs at a fixed dose. Typically, the time frame varies between 14 and 21 days. At the end of that period, those animals are killed or culled, and basically various organs are removed from the animal and they're weighed, okay? And based on that information, based on that data, this is how we allocate those ratios. Now, hopefully, the light bulb just went off and you went, are you serious? So in other words, all of this is based on, we take male rats, we castrate the rats, we administer certain doses of this drug for 14 to 21 days, then we kill the rats, we take out certain organs, and we weigh those organs, and that's where these numbers come from. This data, guys, this data is designed to be phase 2 of a process of the evaluation of androgens in terms of suitability for application in human beings. The first phase is a bioassay, okay, binding to a receptor. The second phase is basically a Hirschberger assay, where we inject the drugs, we keep the drugs in place for a certain fixed number of days, then we cull the animals, we remove the organs, we weigh them. This is not the final say. This is very much 1950s, 1960 technology. And then what you're supposed to do is say, look, it would appear, based on these tests to date, the binding assay and the Hirschberger assay, that we could potentially deploy these drugs in females, and so the drug would then move to human clinical trials, okay? In my opinion, people in the tribe do not understand where these numbers come from. That's a second phase. It isn't designed to do one thing, and that is basically to determine which drugs may be suitable drug candidates to move into human clinical use. That is all it's intended to do. It is not some tool that you then use to determine like which drug we should use because it's more or less androgenic than others. That is just naive in the extreme. I'm sorry. Okay, so then you take these drugs from the Hirschberger assay, and then you put them into, in live human cohorts, and we evaluate their suitability for use based on the feedback that we get from those studies. And this is why I like to look at the studies where they gave relatively large quantities of these drugs to women. Typically most of those studies, unfortunately, are from the heyday of using androgens as therapeutic practice. They're a little dated now. I agree. There's certainly holes in them. Lots of questions I have about them. But I place more faith in a cohort where we took a group of women and we exposed them to, nandrolone, and we exposed them to mastron, and we looked at the actual physical effects in those women over time than I would in a 14-day analysis of a rat prostate and a weighing of organs. Hopefully, people will understand where you should weight the quality of evidence in that regard. Okay, so your takeaway should be this: all of these drugs were fundamentally developed with the intent of maintaining the therapeutic benefits of testosterone whilst minimizing the androgenic impact to make them more suitable, more tolerable in the androgen sensitive. You need to abandon these Hirschberger assays. This is childlike, all right? And you need to approach this from the point of view of saying, look, any drug that was successfully deployed in the androgen sensitive, okay, and appeared to be relatively well tolerated, okay, over time, is a candidate that we could put on the table for plausible discussion here. Any of them, okay? There are many of them, from primobolan to mastron to nandrolone to winstrol, to anadrol, anavar, and of course even trenbolone. Trenbolone is a steroid of SARMs. Now, that doesn't mean that all of these drugs get an automatic pass. It means they pass onto the table for further consideration and whether or not they're suitable to meet our needs. Okay, so if we understand that that's how they arrived there, what's the problem with anabolic steroids? I showed you this study in the webinar that I did, but it's a really important study to understand, and that is, it was done quite a long time ago in 1984, where they basically looked at a relatively small number of women. Unfortunately, there are always flaws to studies. I completely understand. We don't have the studies I would like to see. I agree. In this study, however, we saw 10 female strength athletes where the smallest cycle was 10 milligrams of anavar a day, and the largest cycle was, guess what, 785 milligrams a week during peak load of the last 4 weeks of the cycle. But the biggest, most important takeaway here, most people would look at that and say, 10 milligrams of anavar a day is not going to cause any problems. Most people would look at that and say 785 milligrams a week during the peak load. That's ridiculous. I don't disagree with that, but here's the killer. Here's the problem. Okay. Of the 10 women in that study, the lowest dose used was 10 milligrams of anavar a day. The number of people that reported a lowering of a voice, okay, consequence was 10. 10 out of 10. All of the women reported this effect. 3 of the women said not significant. Fine. That's probably fair to say that the 10 milligram anavar a day was, we don't know, but it's a fair assumption to say she was probably in that group. And it's a fair assumption to say that the lady taking the greatest dose was probably in the undesirable category. That's fair. There's certain assumptions made here. The takeaway, guys, here is this. People, for some reason that I do not understand, think 10 milligrams of anavar a day has no consequence of effect. It does. It does. The average duration of exposure here was basically 2 years over intermittent cycle exposure. The point being here is the total duration of exposure for women is as consequential to outcomes as the peak load that we're basically using. Okay, now, let me go back to our graphic at the top here. Okay, so a quick takeaway from this video. First, understand that what I'm trying to suggest is if you are, this is not intended as first exposure. People need to understand that. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that the first time you expose yourself to anabolic steroids or growth promoters, enhancement tools, you open this box and you dive right in. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, listen, if you're going to live here for a number of years, you have to understand what the real risks of exposure to women are. And they're not kidney health, heart health, brain health. Yes, they need to be considered. But the real problem is basically the likelihood of you experiencing a degree of virilization, masculinization, And some of those consequences are irreversible, like changes to the voice architecture, the voice anatomy. Okay. So if you are going to live here, then it makes rational sense that we try to develop models that are safe for use in that regard. Everything in that green square, okay, is designed to basically, prevent those things coming up to bite you in the bum. Everything in the green square. In the red square, it doesn't matter whether you're taking 10 milligrams of Anavar a day, right, over 2 years, right, intermittently, or basically you're using 100 milligrams of androgens a week, all right. The likelihood of you being touched by that stick is very high based on all of the evidence and all of the observation that we know. So the first thing is try to spend most of your time in the green square. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't put time aside for the red square. So how would we do that? This is the big takeaway from this video. How would we strategically integrate the green square and the red square together? It's really very simple at highest possible level, and that is this. You would pick a period of time during a year where you would say, look, it makes the most sense for me to put those tools on the table for maximum possible return. What would that look like? If you were a competitor and you were competing, what would make sense is that you would potentially do that before a powerlifting meet or potentially before a bodybuilding show. Okay, that makes sense. If you were not competing, if you were simply, basically pursuing your goals, then what would make sense is you would place those tools at a strategically located growth phase. Okay. Now, you could basically say, look, if you're a competitor, probably the truth is historically you've exposed yourself to more androgens than maybe, you should have. And I would even argue that, like, you know what, if you took 60 days a year, 30 days before competition and 30 days at a strategically placed growth phase, and you exposed yourself to some of those drugs, which one of those testosterone derivatives you want to favor? I am very open to personal opinion here, right? Okay. What I'm saying is 60 days exposure at moderate use, right, is probably better than you're doing now, right? It's very, very few people, very few women who use anabolic steroids only see 60 days a year. Right? So if you did 60 days a year, would that potentially inhibit your progress? Would that inhibit your competitive, capacity? Well, yeah, by themselves, I completely agree. But you have to understand what I'm suggesting is you merge that 60 days of use into the box on the right-hand side. And then what you have is very plausibly a model. You'll see better outcomes, right, by bringing the two together, but having a relatively limited amount of exposure to supraphysiological androgen levels over the course of the year. I'll repeat, very few competitive female athletes, whether they're powerlifters or whether they're bodybuilders, can probably look themselves in the mirror and say, look, I have less than 60 days a year of exposure to these androgens. This model with 60 days of exposure, if you strategically set up those 60 days, 2 30-day blocks, could very plausibly mean that you'll get better outcomes than you're realizing now at a plausibly lower risk model from virilization and masculinization effects. As I said in the video yesterday, that means more moving parts. That means more to learn. That is why I'm here, to help you with your education. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that video. As always, if you have any questions, that's great. I am basically working on the enhancedwomen.com website as we speak. I will be continuing to create content for that endeavor. If you enjoy this video, if you would like to see more of this information, please subscribe. Membership is $15 US a month, and I would very much value your support. Sawadee Cup. See you at the next Victor Black Masterclass.